Hello, my dear kids. Welcome to Kiddos Learn.
E is for elephant, E. Elephant, elephant tree. E is for egg, E. Egg, E. E is for eagle, 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 eagle. E is for ear, ear, ear. E is for earth, earth. Oh. E is for engine, 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 engine. E is for envelope, envelope, envelope. Ace. E is for elbow, 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 elbow. E is for eyes, eyes, eyes. E is eyes. E is for 11, 11, ace. E is for eraser, 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 eraser. E is for engineers, engineers, engineers. E is for earrings, 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 dear. E is for exercise, exercise, exercise. E is for exit, 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 exit. E is for easel, easel, easel. E is for eel, 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 eel. E is for elf, 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 elf. E is for acorn, acorn, acorn. E is for echo, N-O, echo. E is for eagle, 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 E is for Egypt, Egypt. E is for eggplant, eggplant, eggplant plant. E is for eggshell, 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 eggshell. Hello friends, come sing with me. Let's learn words with letter E. E says E-A-E. Hooray, let's find E words and shout, yay! E is for elephant, big and gray. E is for F, white and gray. E is for eagle, flying high. E is for ear that helps us try. Letter E, what do you see? I see E words smiling at me. Elephant, egg, and eagle too. Letter elbows with might. E is for elbow, bend your arm. E is for 8, that's part of the charm. Letter E, what do you see? I see E words dancing with me. Earth and egg and elbow too. Learning E is fun to do. E is for eraser, clean and neat. E is for envelope, message, treat. E is for eggplant, purple and round. E is for elf who jumps around. Letter E, sing with me. So many E words. 1, 2, 3. Elephant, elf, airs, eraser, 2. Letter E, we love you. Clap your hands, hooray, hooray. The learn E words all today. Elephant and egg, earth galore. We'll sing E words forevermore.
E is for elephant, elephant, elephant. E is for egg, 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 egg. E is for eagle, 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 eagle. E is for earth, earth, earth bidden. E is for engine, 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 elim. E is for envelope, 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 envelope. E is for elbow, elbow, elore. E is for 8, 8, 8. E is for eyes, 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 eyes. E is for 11, 11, 11, bit. E is for eraser, 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 eraser. E is for engineers, engineers, engineers. E is for earrings, 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 earrings. 4. E is for exercise, 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 exercise. E is for exit, 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 exit. E is for easel, 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 wheel. E is for eel, 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 eel. E is for fidget.